Hello, and welcome to the new Discipleship video series from Heritage Alliance. Thank you for coming to check it out. Over the next few months, I'll be releasing a new video every couple of weeks, and with each new video, we'll focus on a new key moment in the Bible. And what we're hoping to have happen is that as we progress through the Bible, all of us will gain a better understanding as to our place in the story of the Bible. And my use of the word story here is very intentional because, whether we're aware of it or not, all of us are constantly placing ourselves in some kind of story. So we make up terms like the American dream, where anyone who works hard enough can make something of themselves and become successful. Or think of the recruiting posters from World War I and World War II, where the call to action is placed within a narrative of what it means to be a man. Or, more recently, and in great contrast to the old story that promised better years ahead thanks to technology, we today are told that, ironically, it's because of this technology that we face possible suffering and tragedy due to global warming. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that whether we are aware of it or not, our lives are interwoven with both micro and macro narratives. So there's macro narratives like what it takes to be a man or the American dream. But we also live in micro narratives, things that we tell ourselves, things like I'm not important or I'm very important. However, we as Christians are fortunate enough to be a part of a narrative that transcends any kind of major world event or personally held conviction. We are part of a story that was set in place at the beginning of time, and is still to this day being worked out by the Creator and Lord of the universe. And, as you probably know, this story has its beginning in the Bible, so it's to the Bible we will go to find out where we fit in. Along the way, we will be operating with a few basic assumptions that I believe will greatly increase the fruit we see in our lives as a result of our time here. So what are these assumptions? Well, first off, we're going to assume that God's Word is what it says it is. And that is that it is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So it is safe to assume that God's Word will have an effect on you, especially if you open yourself up to being vulnerable to it. If you're not open to being vulnerable to it, then it's safe to say that it might not have an effect on you. But no matter how familiar you are with the text, no matter how many times you've memorized and studied the scriptures, God's Word is living and active, and it can change you in ways that it never has before. Our next assumption is that it is God's pleasure to guide us and lead us as we study the Word and seek to apply it to our lives. And we know this because that is exactly the model that He set up as the means through which the mission would be fulfilled. He gave us the Spirit to help us and the Word to guide us. And our final assumption is that God is speaking. And I know that this sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes I feel like we don't always act like this is the case. But we know from the Bible that when God's children come together to pray, listen, discern, and with vulnerability share what they've been hearing, God's will can become apparent. So those are the assumptions we'll be working with in this series. God's Word is living and active, He wants to help us, and we can hear what He is saying when we work together as a group. Okay, so now it's time to look at what the study method for this series will look like. As we progress through this series, our study method will be grounded in a few basic foundational questions. Questions like, what is God revealing about Himself in this passage? What does the passage tell us about us as human beings? What is the main meaning of this story? Where do I see myself in relation to this passage? What tangible or practical thing might God be asking me to do in response to this passage? So I won't necessarily be asking specific questions about the chapters we read each week. Rather, what I'm going to do is ask very similar, if not the same questions over and over, with the hope that we eventually get good at answering them. To get us started, and to give an example of what this might look like, let's look at a passage that we won't be studying in this series. If we turn to our Bibles to Exodus 20 verses 1 to 3, we read, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Now we can simply go through the questions. What is God revealing Himself in this passage? Well, you could say that God demands that He be put first. Or you could simply say that He is claiming to be the one who brought the people out of Egypt. What does this passage tell us about us as human beings? A perfectly fine answer to this question in regards to this passage is that it doesn't seem to address us in the 21st century, but for the people to whom this passage was addressed, it seems like God is saying that they owe their very existence to Him, since He is the one who brought them out of slavery. What is the main meaning of this story? Well, the main meaning of this story seems to be that God has delivered the people from slavery and He now demands their allegiance. Where do I see myself in relation to this passage? Well, here we go. All I need to do is ask myself if God has rescued me from anything. And the answer to that, of course, is a great big yes. What tangible or practical thing might God be asking me to do in response to this passage? One thing I could do in response to this passage is spend 5 minutes a day praying specifically for my heart to be loyal to God alone. So we can see that the point of this series is to engage with the Bible and its author, because the Bible ultimately was written for all of us. And it is my hope that in the next few months we will all grow in our understanding of how we fit in the long story that began way back in the very beginning. And with that in mind, let's get into our passage for this week, which is Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. And what I want to have happen now is for all of you to read these passages, and if you're in a group, read them out loud. And what's going to happen is that I'm going to put the Bible passage on the screen first, and when the Bible passage is on the screen, simply pause the video there and read it. And then after the Bible passage, I'll put the questions on the screen. When the questions are on the screen, pause the video again and just go through the questions and answer them and go through any discussion that they might spark for you. And remember the assumptions we're making as we go through this. God's Word is living and active. He wants to help us. He is speaking to us, and as a group we can hear Him. So if you're all ready, here is the Bible passage, and then following the Bible passage will be the questions. Okay, now that passage ends with a big letdown, and that story can be quite discouraging, but not all is as hopeless as it seems. As we'll see next time, God is not done with the human race. After He drove us out of the garden, He began the long, difficult process of getting us back in. And as we will find out as we progress through the biblical story, we today are still a part of that long and difficult process. And I want to encourage you to take your responses to these questions seriously and hold each other accountable to them. And this will be helped greatly if you keep your responses specific, measurable, and attainable. So instead of saying something like, I'm going to try to love Jesus more, say something specific like, I'm going to spend 10 more minutes a day praying. So be specific and be realistic. And that is our challenge, and it will be our challenge again and again as we journey through the Bible and find out how God responds to the mess Adam and Eve got us all into. But for now, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.